Hopefully you can all hear me okay. I think I'm in a bit of an echoey room, so fingers crossed. You can hear and see me okay. Excellent, thank you. What? You had a dust cloud in Essex? Sounds a bit crazy. We had a dust cloud once when I lived in Australia, and it was literally like the apocalypse. It was red because of the red dirt. Mad. Well, shall we? Bit of an echo. Sorry, everyone. It's because I'm in a really echoey room, annoyingly. But yeah, hopefully it's not too painful to listen to. Try and shuffle you a bit closer to me. Well, Vicky, do you think perhaps we should get cracking?
Yeah, sounds good.
Alrighty. Just organise my screen a little bit here. Now, unfortunately, everyone, I won't be able to see the chat while I'm chatting, but Vicky will be monitoring that. So if you have any questions in relation to kind of technical bits and pieces, or just want to chat and share reactions kind of as we go, do feel free in the chat. And otherwise, if you've got questions that you'd like to ask me, please, if you could pop those in the Q&A box, that would be super helpful. And then we'll have some time to answer all of the questions at the end. I also wanted to let you know that you will get a copy of the deck and the recording at the end of the session. So if there's anything you'd like to revisit, you are more than welcome to. Or if you've got colleagues who haven't been able to make it along this morning, they'll be able to catch that as well. So this is, I mean, it's already been a lovely, warm welcome, getting to chat with everyone a little bit as you came in. So thanks so much for choosing to spend some time with me today. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And I'm going to be sharing a glimpse into the world of students as we see it on the Student Room forums. And I should also say, I suppose, that I'm the head of Student Voice and Diversity at the Student Room. But I'd like to start by finding out a little bit more about you, but not in the way we might usually do that, talking about job titles or companies, etc. I'd like to know a little bit about what drives you. You've come to this webinar to hear all about what students are thinking and experiencing, so I assume that you care about students and young people in some way, but what really motivates you? So that's our first question to start the day. So if we could pop that poll up, please, Vicky. Don't worry, the results are anonymous. It's just we'll just see the total votes at the end. So I'll give you a moment to vote now. You can click as many options as you like, just whatever resonates with you. So are you motivated by ensuring young people are fulfilled in their educational journey? Maybe by your own challenging experiences as a young person? Maybe you've realized that the system supporting students need improving. Want to ensure every young person has a future they can look forward to. Maybe you're interested in supporting young people with their well-being. And while you vote, I just want to chat a little bit, I suppose, about this focus on what drives us and why we're here, really, I suppose. I think sometimes it's really easy to focus on what we do rather than why we do it. For example, for lots of young people, their minds are always filled with the what they'll become when they grow up, what step comes next, what subjects they should choose, what exam they're revising for, what work experience they should be getting. And it can be really hard to stop and ask why. And that's one of the things we're going to try hard to understand, or which we do try hard to understand as we listen to the conversations on the Student Room from students. And what I'm going to try and share with you today is not just what students are thinking, but also what might be motivating those conversations. So if we can have a look at those poll results, please, Vicky. Ah, amazing, look at that. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, just reading the votes there. Amazing. So I suppose the thing is that what really unites all of us here is we're trying to make the world a better place for young people. And that's why we've all made the space in our diaries for this session today. And I'm here for the same reason. So it's my personal mission to always work with and on behalf of young people to help them find lives and futures that they love. I have a background in secondary education as a teacher and a head of year, and I worked in various roles at the student room for the past 5 years, but everything I've done has always been focusing on young people in some capacity. And I thought I'd start this session, as I mean to go on, with a real representation of my reality and give the glossy headshot a miss. These are photos of my face when I'm talking to students. This was in December at our student advisory board meetings. They're not very flattering pictures and they're not very good quality. I think you can see my washing in the back of one of them even. But this is a version of me being totally fulfilled by having spent quality time listening to young people, bearing witness to their struggles, their humility and all the hope that they have as well, and knowing that I'm about to do everything in my power to keep improving the systems that are there to support them. And that's why I'm here today, because I know that when we work together to really listen to young people and to build those learnings into better support for them, that's how we drastically increase their chances of living a life they love. So to orientate us a bit, at the student room, we have an amazing market research arm called TSR Insight. We do incredible in-depth research with students. But what we're talking about today is a little bit different. So like these unfiltered photos of my face, the conversations you'll hear from students today are raw and they're real. I'm going to share some of the peer-to-peer discussions that have been happening in our forum so far in 2022. I know we've got people joining us from all sorts of different organisations today, so there's a bit of everything that I'll share. You'll see a mixture of temperature check polls and quotes directly from students' conversations on the forums, and I'll be doing my best to share some of my experiences and perspective about the why. So let's get started. And I have just seen a comment about my fairy lights. Thank you. Sadly, I don't have them anymore, but they were excellent. I agree, everything's better with fairy lights. So I thought we'd kick off with something that's front of mind for many students this time of year, exams, yay. I'd like to take you on a bit of a journey through what students have been navigating so far this year. So if you can cast your minds back to January, there was still an air of uncertainty about whether exams would go ahead in 2022. Following from 2 years of altered exam seasons, students were pretty much braced for anything. And with contingency plans having been announced in November, including encouraging more mock exams in case teacher-assessed grades had to be used, students were very much on the revision assessment hamster wheel already by this point. It's actually quite rare that we see results this divided when we ask questions on the student room. So for every student who was desperate for exams to go ahead, there was another student who was filled with absolute anxiety at the thought. And for this cohort of year 11s and 13s, most of them haven't sat formal exams since year 6, which is 5 years ago for year 11th. And for year 13s, that's half of their educational lives ago. So understandably, some students also really don't know how to feel about exams. For those who did want exams to go ahead, the reasons are varied, and I've shared a few quotes from students in the discussion here. The concept of fairness often comes up for those students wanting to sit exams, but it's not a choice between fair, being the familiar exam system, and unfair, being teacher-assessed grades. There's a recognition that both systems aren't perfectly fair, especially given the effect the pandemic has had on students' learning, depending on their circumstance. And there's a feeling that teacher-assessed grades give space for further injustice in the system of assigning grades. So to these students, exams seem like a better option. Other students simply want the opportunity to prove themselves. We saw comments like this coming from year 11s and 13s and also from reset candidates. It really makes me think back to some of the stories we've been hearing from the 2020 and 2021 cohorts who spoke about the feeling of having been given, and I use quotation marks here, fake grades. Despite those same students telling me that the grades still enabled them to move on to the next step they were hoping for, and we know that wasn't the case for everyone, the sense of imposter syndrome and worry about how the grades might be perceived in future is something that they still haven't shaken. Rightly or wrongly, in the past year, I've heard so many instances of students talking about how their grades define them. These year 11s and 13s have witnessed those two cohorts before them going through, again, the nightmare, as one student described it, of not sitting exams. Many members of the 2022 cohort want a result that feels like they have had some element of control over it. On the other hand, for the students who were advocating for the cancellation of exams, many spoke about the impact disruptions have had on their education. For some, it was centered around the difficulty they had faced as a result of online learning and still trying to recover from that in January. And for students who are affected by digital poverty, lack of access to devices, or have additional needs like SEND students and those facing mental health challenges, the significance of the barriers they faced to learning over the past 2 years really can't be underestimated. Others spoke of the ongoing nature of disruptions they were still dealing with in January. So this poll took place around the same time absence rates due to COVID reached record numbers in England, with an estimated 315,000 students off for COVID-related reasons, and an estimated 44,000 teachers and school leaders absent as well. And on TSR, some students spoke about the majority of their classes having been taught by supply teachers, while others were having their classes merged. As someone who has done supply teaching in England myself, I can't emphasize enough what a difficult situation this is for both teachers and students. And I just thought I'd give you a bit of context about that. When I was teaching, I once spent a term covering a teacher who'd gone off unexpectedly on long-term sick, and she was the only music teacher in the school, and she was too unwell to set lessons. And the school couldn't find a specialist to cover her, as there was a shortage of supply teachers in the area at the time. Now, I don't have a musical bone in my body, sadly, but supply teachers very rarely teach subjects that they're actually qualified to teach. So I'm trained to teach English drama and film. But when I was supply teaching, I usually taught maths, music, and design technology. And did I learn to play ukulele in a week on YouTube? Yes, I did. But for the GCSE and A-level students who were in the lead up to their exams, there was just so little that I could do to help them, despite all of my efforts. They really needed their teacher, and it was just an impossible situation. If you add a pandemic, years of disrupted learning, immense pressure to cover the curriculum, delivering mock exams and supporting revision to that equation, it just makes me really sad to think of the ongoing stress and disruption still happening as a result of COVID. Teachers and students are working incredibly hard to mitigate that. But we have to remember that just because while we haven't been in a lockdown for a while, doesn't mean that the impacts aren't still being felt in a really tangible way. But nevertheless, exams look set to go ahead. So moving on to February, when advanced information was released by JCQ and the exam boards as part of the support package in recognition of the disruption caused by the pandemic. And it was to help students prioritise their revision. Although students would have loved to have received the advanced information earlier, they seemed pretty glad to have been given some guidance and their scope having been narrowed a bit, especially as lots of them are still learning new content as we speak. But now that students have managed to access their advanced information, they're a bit, shall we say, underwhelmed. Some students really struggled to access the advanced information in the first place, having some confusing experiences with technical glitches on exam board websites. And I think it's also important to reflect here on the role of digital access and skills in using tools like advanced information. According to Nominet's Digital Youth Index, 17 to 18% of 14 to 19-year-olds don't have access to a laptop or desktop, and 18% of students who receive free school meals are reliant entirely on mobile phone data to access the internet, and that's compared to 15% of their non-free school meals peers. So for some students, even accessing the materials can be a significant hurdle. But many students also noted the difference in the level of detail being provided by exam boards. So for the same subjects, students studying different exam boards were having pretty different levels of information. While others spoke about a caveat that seemed to have appeared on the advanced information, saying that topics not listed on the advanced information might still be asked in the exam. So what we're hearing from a lot of students now is that their revision is largely the exact same as it would have been without advanced information. And they're still trying to learn content up until the Easter holidays. So As we move on, I would just like to ask another poll question. Do you think there's a connection between exams and mental health? You could get that poll up. Thank you, Vicky. There's no right or wrong answer to this. Just whatever you think. How are we going there, Vicky? Oh, amazing. Oh, look at that, 96%. Interesting, very interesting. We asked students exactly the same question. And here's what they think. Very close to what you thought, actually. This poll's actually just been running this week. And unsurprisingly, much like you said, it's a resounding yes. Mental health and exams are definitely linked, according to students. It's really interesting to read students' reflections on their mental health during the exam period. The high pressure environment around exams certainly does rank highly on many students' radars as something that can cause extreme levels of stress. One person here spoke about the need for assessments to move away from point-in-time exams in order to really understand students' knowledge, while another in the same discussion spoke about the physical impact on health in relation to exam stress and developing headaches and acid reflux during the exam season. A second student quoted here speaks about mental health breakdowns being par for the course, according to their teacher. A number of other students were quick to mention that exams are definitely not the only reason they might be experiencing negative impacts on their mental health. Our third student here speaks so well, I think, about all that's being asked of young people during the exam period in other parts of their lives too. And speaking from my teaching experience, I often saw young people still developing the practical, emotional, and interpersonal toolkit that should help them navigate these life challenges. So it's no wonder that times like these are putting pressure on students that can sometimes feel like a little bit too much. It's also really interesting to see the student also speaking about those who may need extra support but might be struggling to access it. On a bit of a side note, I have to say this tendency to think of others who might be having a different experience is something that I notice with young people a lot. Seeing poll results and conversations like this just reminds me that for many students, knowing the content and sitting the exam can be just one part of the battle. The toll on well-being and mental health is something that many students tell me isn't addressed enough. A student told me the other day that they might get an assembly about exam anxiety, but that's about it. It makes me wonder how we can work together to help ease the burden on the students and what best practice can be learned from on this. So now we have a good handle on where students are at with their exams. Something else that's pretty much constantly on their minds is that big question, what do I do with my life? At the student room, we see students grappling with this question all the time. And let's be honest, do we ever really work it out? I don't know. But nevertheless, according to our social norms, that's exactly the task at hand for them as they decide what the next few years will hold. I'd like to acknowledge here that we should remember the self-selecting nature of students who find themselves filling in polls on the student room. We should assume there might be a level of skewing here, but I will say that in general, I find that the feedback we get through the polls in the community very much reflects what we hear from our student advisory board, which is made up of students of all sorts of different backgrounds and experiences who might not actually be members of the student room. So I think we can be comfortable about the integrity of what we're seeing here. So I'd like to share with you 3 things that students have told us about their pathway choices so far in 2022. The first thing is in January, we learned that almost half of students had not considered an apprenticeship. In February, we learned that just shy of 80% of year 12s and 13s are considering university after college. And around the same time, 1 in every 2 students who completed our What Path Was Right for Me quiz found that a degree apprenticeship might be the most suitable option for them. But hang on, what? How can all those things be true all at once? Is it maybe a little bit contradictory? I don't know. Is it? Seriously, I'm asking. What do you think is going on here? We've got another poll. See how I did that. How do you think all of these things can be true? How is it that we can hear that students haven't considered an apprenticeship? Lots of them are thinking about going to university, but also that we're hearing that for half of them, degree apprenticeships might actually be something that they're interested in. Is it because uni is being talked about the most by family and social influencers? Is it because uni is complicated to get into? So we have students talking about it more on TSR. Is because college, careers advice at college and school is often skewed towards uni, or is it all of the above? And while you're voting there, I just want to reflect quickly on this degree apprenticeships fact, actually. I had a good chat with Grace about this. She's our expert pathways community manager, and she was reflecting on how interesting it is that many of the students selected options throughout the quiz which indicated an interest in learning, which is both practical and theoretical. There's a desire to have combinations of the typical uni experience, but with very tangible real world skills that they can take out with them straight away. And it's just my own pondering, but I'm so intrigued about the impetus behind this thinking. My spidey senses tell me that the desire's probably always been there, but I do also wonder about the over-reliance on theoretical learning during the pandemic for a lot of these students, and whether this has ignited a new or maybe renewed push for those practical approaches from students. Just a thought. Results, thank you. All of the above. Wow, you figured me out, everyone. It's true, all of the above. These are a collection of quotes on the next slide from students from two discussions on the student room. So one that I just mentioned, where students were talking about what pathway they're considering after college. And the other is from when we asked them what could be improved about careers advice, which I'll show you the results of in a moment. And these kind of help to explain, I think, some of the reasoning behind those three facts that I just shared with you. I wanted to share these quotes with you in particular, not because they're representative of the whole story, they're not. There are lots of young people speaking on the student room about their excitement to start university, or about the doors it's opened for them, and about the comprehensive support they've received in navigating these decisions about their future. But I wanted to speak about the students for whom that is not their experience. They're a really important part of the story. Those students who feel drawn to futures other than university, or for whom university isn't an option. We often hear that these students can feel underinformed and misunderstood. Like society is telling them that not going to university means that they've somehow failed. Now we know that that's not true, but we see a system of careers advice at school and college which is struggling to meet the needs of young people. I hasten to add that while some of these comments do speak about specific experiences with careers advisors, we do also see students acknowledging that much of the issue stems from the resource challenges that school and colleges face in general, and when it comes to provisions for careers advice. I know personally how hard staff across school, colleges, and universities work to provide the best support to students, and I have a deep respect for those whose job it is to fit that in around all the many other responsibilities they have. I myself was one of those professionals, so I really appreciate that balancing act. But I think what we see here is a huge amount of opportunity to find new ways to provide students with career support about future decision-making, which is holistic and grounded in experience. And interestingly, better work experience was the #1 thing students said could help improve careers advice when we asked in February. This is the second poll that I mentioned a moment ago, relating to the quotes in the previous slide. Next was regular one-on-one sessions with the careers guidance professional or mentor, and the sense of having someone who knows them and understands their interests and hope. It comes up a lot when students are talking about careers advice that they'd like to receive. And the third thing that they were saying could make careers advice better was improving the awareness of all the different options after school and college. And I'm sure there are lots of people in this room who've been part of similar conversations about highlighting the awareness of those different options available. I just wanted to finish this section with a little quote I spied on Monday because a friend of mine liked it on Instagram. It was really interesting. I was writing this presentation and it came up and it really kind of piqued my interest. I think it's really interesting to think about the weight that as a society we tend to put on the shoulders of young people when it comes to making decisions about their futures. I'm not sure about the original meaning of this statement and whether it's meant to highlight the sudden jump from child to adult, which is a really important point, but my read on it is slightly different. As I said earlier, every day I see students grappling with making big decisions about their lives, but I don't think they behave like children. Our 18-year-olds have often taken on a lot of the mental load around adulthood much earlier, as we saw when speaking about the stress around exams, for example. These kids in particular have had to employ skills of resilience, problem solving, and self-care during the pandemic, which I'm sure we'd all wish they hadn't needed to. The young people I see are so earnest in their approach to their future decision-making. They are pained to make sure that whatever they're choosing is right and the best thing. But it's no wonder that that's such a difficult task when their view of what's possible is often so blinkered and they're led to believe that what they choose now is so finite. When we know that many of these young people will have many different careers, they'll do jobs that don't exist yet in industries that are only just emerging, using technology that hasn't even been created. I think what we're seeing here is an incredible opportunity to excite and empower young people about their futures with support that's inclusive and constantly evolving. Now, as we do have a number of people from universities here with us today, I do want to spend a moment here speaking about what we're hearing from those students who are currently in the process of applying to university. When we asked in February about firm and insurance choices, we could see that most students were still waiting for offers before they could make those decisions. One of our community members set up a really lovely thread, and it was called UCAS 2022 Applicants, How Are You Coping with the Wait to Hear Back from Universities? And this first quote is what they wrote in their original post on the thread. You can then see two excerpts of replies from students. Some students in the thread talk about trying to stay focused on working on their exams while simultaneously checking emails, UCAS and TSR multiple times a day for updates. And lots of them speak about the stress they feel while they're playing the waiting game to hear from universities. And of course, it's completely understandable. They know they're about to face a huge life change, but the particulars of exactly what's about to happen are pretty outside their control once they've submitted their applications. It's also interesting to see a number of them talking about college decision reactions, which is a phenomenon made popular in the US with YouTube videos of students finding out whether they'd been accepted or rejected from their choices. It's just really interesting, I think, that that's become so popular. The anticipation is just so built up for some students. It's interesting to see that one student mentioned clearing in the thread also. Generally, we find students don't start thinking about clearing until much closer to results, and sometimes not until after they've received their results. In this thread, it's really interesting to see a few students pondering the possibility, but it's very much with an air of hoping that they won't have to cross that particular bridge, which again is understandable. So for the year 12s and 13s who are on their application journeys at the moment, we asked specifically what support they would need with making those decisions right now. Broadly, we find that students can often really struggle to weigh up the pros and cons of each course and each university they're considering to make a definitive choice. We do a lot of work with the community to support them in this, but they're also looking for more specific course information from universities themselves. We've also seen how much students want to be able to get into the nitty-gritty of understanding the course, and polls last year showed that taster lectures can also be helpful with this. For students who may not have access to the information, advice, and guidance they really need, understanding the whole process of applying to university, then making the move to uni, can be really difficult. Bearing in mind they're also dealing with that same revision exam hamster wheel that we talked about earlier, and all the other life challenges. Anything that can break down the process and make it easier to understand is really helpful. And finally, in the top four, we can see the return of in-person open days run by the university. Virtual open days still have their place, especially for connecting with students who don't have the ability to visit campus, But the in real life aspect is something many missed while not being able to visit unis themselves the past couple of years. We hear a lot of students talking about the vibe of university. They're really keen to get a feel of the place they could call home for at least the next 3 years. And the more that you can make them feel part of that, the better. So I'd like to finish with just a couple of things to remember. So super quickly, fewer lockdowns this year does not equal a return to normal for students. Exams are inextricably linked to mental health. I've written this in just such a naff way. Careers advice is ripe for the optimizing. There's really a lot that we could do to help improve that for students. And that work experience and one-to-one support are things that students really are looking for. And lastly, that current applicants want to be able to compare, get into the detail, and get the process right when they're applying to university. And most importantly, I want to return to the beginning and remember that we're all here for a reason. If I could implore you to do one thing after this session, it's to consider how you embed the voice of students into what you do to support them. Honestly, finding out why students do, think, and say what they do is an absolute game changer. I know I've presented a bunch of polls and numbers today, but I hope the quotes from students and the context I've shared also helps spark some thinking for you about what's driving their needs at the moment. And if you've stayed until this point, hopefully it's because you've found this useful. Yeah, really genuinely, I just wanted to thank you for choosing to spend some time with me today. Don't forget that the recording and the deck will be shared with you after this, and we have plenty of time for questions now. So Vicky, perhaps if we could finish the screen sharing there, and I'll have a gander at the Q&A box. Thank you. I'm going to just start by looking in the Q&A box and answering some questions, and then I will pop into the chat and have a look at those as well. If anyone fancies turning their camera on, I would welcome it, by the way, staring at the massive version of my face. Cool, I have a question from Claire. Do you know how many year 13s know what they want to study and what career they want versus those who don't? That's a really interesting question. I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head, but I would say from the polls that we see, like the one that I spoke about in the session where 80% of students in year 12 and 13 were saying that they were considering university after college, I think there's probably a delay in time in terms of thinking you know what you want to do and confirming that that is the thing that you end up going and doing. I think probably a lot of students sit in the undecided camp. I think unless you are a student who has very specific vocational goals, like for example, medicine, often dentistry, things like that. But feedback that I hear from students in general is that if they don't have an interest, which in their words they describe as like mainstream, I find the way they describe it really interesting. If you don't have an interest that is mainstream, and in that list they say things like medicine, dentistry, nursing, teaching, business, I think also they mentioned in that list, then it can be really difficult to know what options are available to them, and they find they get less information from schools or colleges about those, like what the next step could be after college or school, if that's one of their interests, if they are interested in these less mainstream options. So I think it's a really interesting point, and it probably harks back to what we saw there with the results about careers advice in school, very often speaking about the university experience. And if that doesn't suit a student, sometimes I think it can be hard for them to know what they might want to do. But that's an incredibly vague question, but that's some context that I have around that. Could unis offer careers advice at open days? That's a really interesting question. I think it'd be really interesting to hear from universities whether that's something that they're interested in, I suppose. It would be interesting to know students' perspective on going to a university open day, thinking that they're going to go to that university. Is that like, would they be in the space to listen to careers advice that could tell them something different? Alternatively, could it tell them about other options at that university? I'm not sure, but it's a really interesting point about, you know, where is the central moment that we get lots of students who are thinking about their futures, and how could we plug support into that? Really interesting question. Can I have access to the pathway quiz results or findings, please? So you will be able to access after this session, I think. Vicky might be able to correct me. Each month, I put together a small update of things like this from the community, which I send out, and there is some information in there about those pathway results, quiz findings, if you'd like to have access to those. They get sent around in emails and things from Vicky and the team, but I'm sure we can send that out to you. How does the Student Advisory Board work? Is another question, thank you. So the Student Advisory Board is something we have in pilot this year, which is really, really exciting. It's something that I've wanted to put together for a long time, so it's very exciting to have our board all set up this year. They're a group of about 15 young people who work with us. They're aged between 14 and 18. And essentially they work with us throughout the year. We meet with them multiple times throughout the year, and we speak with them about all sorts of different things. They're a board which really advise us to make sure that we're keeping our feet on the ground with students. Although we have an incredible resource in the forums, we want to make sure that we're listening to a group of people throughout the year who can tell us sort of how their year pans out, I suppose, tell us the things we don't always expect to hear. And then we use what we learn from those. Perhaps something to pick up with an account manager, I would have thought, or one of the team, I'm sure, can chat with you about that if it's something that you're interested in. But yeah, the Student Advisory Board for us is kind of a TSR-based resource for us to make sure that we're really listening to students in that way. But yeah, definitely open to a conversation. How successful are careers fairs for students who are unsure on future prospects? It's a really interesting question, actually. We, on the same poll, I think, that we were looking at a moment ago, we asked, in relation to careers advice, we did ask about, in relation to students who are making decisions about their university right now, we asked about whether students were going to go to things like a more general HE or UCAS fair. And it was really interesting how few were choosing to go to those fairs. I'm a bit unsure. It'd be interesting to find out actually kind of what the general vibe is in relation to careers fairs for students who are looking at future prospects, and sort of to what extent those students have started to go back to those now since the lockdowns have finished. So yeah, really, really good question about careers fairs. Someone said the pressures and stresses are clear. What resources are currently available to actively aid students' mental health? Yeah, really good question. I mean, we're very fortunate to work with a number of wonderful organisations who are there to support students in relation to their mental health. We also have a mental health forum on the student room, which is a great place for students to have peer-to-peer discussions about mental health, which are an important part, I think, of that experience. But at the same time, we're very aware that for many students, it might be the case that they need to be connected with an organisation or an expert who is in a better position to help them. So for that reason, as I said, we work with Papyrus, Prevention of Youth Suicide, Samaritans, and also Student Space run by Student Minds to help those students as much as possible. We do see that some students get wonderful support from their schools, but we know that that's not always the case. And we all know, as as I spoke about during the presentation, that schools don't always have, or colleges don't always have the resources. It can be the same. I know that there are incredibly hardworking teams in universities in student support, but we know that as a nation, there's more support that is needed for mental health across the board, but especially for young people. So there is support there at the moment, but I often find myself pondering aloud what other things we might be able to do to support students in that respect, especially for those students who are going through an exam system which doesn't seem set to change the way that we assess students anytime soon. So I'm very interested in how we work on supporting their mental health around that. Yeah, it's a really good point, actually. The next question is, mental health services at universities are very overcrowded and many students are unaware even where to seek help. The CAMS waiting list can be more than 18 weeks. Yeah, we've seen even more than that, sadly. Does the student room offer advice for students of where they can get help quickly? Hopefully my response to that previous question has helped with that. We do, as I say, have the forum where students can speak to other students, but also we'd really recommend some of those services. And there's so many wonderful services in addition to the ones that we work with closely. We also have connections with Good Thinking London. Yeah, there's a long list, M4, Young Minds. There's a lot of resources there, a lot of people who are very keen to help young people, but connecting them with that sometimes can be the most important first step. Do you have evidence that applicants are taking longer this year to decide their permanent insurance choices? It's a really good question. So I think the poll that I was speaking about during the session was talking about the fact that a lot of students hadn't received their offers yet, so that they hadn't, and that was in January or February. We haven't asked again since then, though, so it would be interesting to hear. We also have some more research which goes on. I mentioned at the beginning our market research team, TSR Insight, and they do some regular surveys of the community and our Navigating Changing Options report, which asks lots of sort of in-depth questions, and they're also super open. If there's anything that you're hoping to find out from students and might want to do something a little bit more in depth, they're an incredible team doing incredible work. Have you seen many comments about the importance of going to Russell Group universities this year? Do you think this is still being seen as important as it used to be? Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we do see a lot of students on the student room speaking about going to Russell Group universities and things like, courses with early application deadlines, Oxbridge, medicine, dentistry, etc. And I think the reason for that is because it's quite complicated, I think, for students to get into those courses, and they have to be pretty ahead of the ball game. Is also really, it's really competitive, obviously, to get into them. So the students, like the students who are talking about waiting for their offers from university, we have a lot of threads where students who are hoping to get offers from those universities are very keenly waiting for those. However, that's not to say that there aren't a great deal more students who are not going to Russell Group universities, who don't necessarily have the same need to be talking about it at the same time. So it's hard for me to comment on exactly the perception of Russell Group universities. I think that's another really good question, though, that we might be able to ask the community at some point about what is the perception of going to Russell Group universities, and is it important? Can you provide the demographics of the students that took part, genders and ages? So the poll, I assume you're talking about the polls that we were speaking about throughout the session, or that I was speaking about throughout the session. So those polls are open to all members of the student room community. And we don't record gender against them. We can sometimes drill down into year level if we need to. But in general, these polls, as I was saying at the beginning, are temperature checks of the kind of overall sentiment in the community at the time. For that kind of in-depth stuff, as I was talking about, our TSR Insight team are wonderful at that sort of work and are able to drill down into that detail and target that research in a more specific way than kind of this sentiment temperature checking. Have students given feedback about how beneficial school support for UCAS applications has been? Really interesting question. We get really mixed feedback. I think some students get wonderful support from their schools and colleges in relation to UCAS applications and seem really well informed about the process and how it all works. But we also equally see, I would say, just as many students who are confused about the process and who really need that little bit more support. I suppose that's one of those situations where students will have incredibly different experiences based on the school they go to, based on their ability to kind of attend school even for some students. So I think that's probably a specific sort of experience depending on the level of support that those students have access to in the first place. How are apprenticeships generally viewed by students? It's a really interesting question. We do have a community of students on the student room who speak about apprenticeships and who are interested. I think it's really interesting, some of the quotes that you will have seen when we were speaking about the careers advice piece, where we saw students who were saying things like, I would love to have done I would love to have done an apprenticeship, but my parents want me to go to university. Or I told my careers advisor that I would like to do an apprenticeship and they gave me advice about university. So I think that there is interest, and I feel very intrigued by degree apprenticeships. And I think what we saw from that What Path is Right for Me quiz was a really interesting indicator actually of what an exciting opportunity degree apprenticeships might be for a lot of students. But I would say that perhaps the awareness level about degree apprenticeships is not to the same extent, or apprenticeships is not to the same extent as what we see for university, which I think sort of highlights the point that I was sharing around students really want to be made aware of all the different pathways that are available to them. But I think they're also aware of a pressure that exists to attend university. And if they don't, as I was saying in the session, it can feel a little bit like they've failed, which again, we know isn't true. But I think that there's still a bit of a social expectation, perhaps, that is the best option for everyone. Do you have any information on what students are looking for in their accommodation at university and how this affects going to university? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'm going to kind of not answer that because we are going to be running a poll about university accommodation at some point in the next couple of weeks. So hopefully that will give us some really useful information about that. How important is being able to book their accommodation when making decisions about their offers? I've noticed that a lot of universities have opened accommodation booking really early this year. Do you think this would persuade some students to accept their offer there just so they can get their accommodation sorted? I don't know the answer to that question, but my thinking about the previous years I've been at the student room and I've seen students kind of closer to results, even trying to book accommodation and things, I know that it can be a real source of worry for students. And it's something I think that we see students trying to sort as soon as they can. Also, even things like, we see people who are not even very far through their first year at university and they're already sorting out accommodation for their second year at university. So I think like anyone, students like certainty. And I think, while they do find it hard waiting for offers and things like that, I think the more certainty that they can get sooner, I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that they were interested in being able to sort out. But at the same time, I'm sure you can have students who will not necessarily be swayed by that as well. So I mean, that's just my pondering. Cool. I think that's all of our questions in the Q&A box for now. Just going to check out a bit of the chat. I'm so sorry, just pause briefly while I read through. when I was considering what to do post A-level, my form group tutor advised that weekly form group sessions were for students working on UCAS applications. I assume that if students weren't intending on applying to university, they were encouraged not to attend. I used to be a form tutor, and that makes me feel a little bit sad that was the case, that people might have been excluded from form sessions if they weren't intending on going to university. I'm just reading through some more of these comments. Thank you. I'm really glad that you found this interesting. Yes, Bryony, we will be sharing the slides and the video. To the questions about universities offering careers advice at open days. At Leicester, our careers service is present at open days and usually do a presentation. That's lovely. Thanks very much, everyone. Okay, great. I can't see any more questions at the moment. I'm just double checking the Q&A box. Got one more question. Do your thoughts and feedback on what support students want between results day and starting uni? Do they feel pressure to find friends? Oh, that's a really good question. So what are your thoughts on how to support students? Or what support students want between results day and starting university? I think between results day and starting university is a bit of a mad time for a lot of students, and probably for all of you as well. I think, yeah, there's a big piece, I think, in relation to inducting students into university life, which isn't just, obviously there's the practical side of moving into university, into understanding your schedule and making sure you get all your textbooks and things like that. But I think for a lot of students, it's the social side that makes them quite nervous, and you can understand why, I suppose. But also, these are students who might have had a really disjointed social experience for the last couple of years. I spoke late last year at the Student Futures Commission about mental health and wellbeing and student support at universities, especially with these cohorts who are coming in having been so impacted by the pandemic. And something that we spoke about there was the need for really comprehensive induction programs, which do take into account and provide opportunities for students to do the friendship making, to understand the university's social life, to encourage them to get involved in that and provide opportunities that are perhaps gently scaffolded. Things like mentoring and that sort of stuff as well, I think, can be super handy. But we also spoke in the Student Futures Commission about the need for even second years and third years needing that as well, because those students also have potentially had a really, really disjointed social experience. So the more that they can experience that, the uni life side of university, we do see students talking about one of the biggest draw cards of going to university being the experience of uni life, as well as obviously what they're going to learn in their classes. So I think help with that reassurance around that, knowing what to expect, opportunities that are beyond Freshers Week as well, support that they might continue to get throughout the year, or things that they might have access to throughout the year, I think are always gratefully received. Also, things that involve not drinking. We always have questions every year about what people can do at Freshers if they don't drink. Just a thing that we very often see. There seems to be a lot of external mental health service being offered and suggested, but what's being provided in-house by schools? Given the results around mental health and exams, it seems like in-house is very needed. Yeah, I don't disagree with you. Personally, I think the real struggle is the same one that I know a lot of universities will have, most schools and colleges I think will have, is the ability to resource that support can be super, super difficult. And I think where exams and those grades are seen as one of the most important things, I think it can be really hard for schools to be able to prioritise the pastoral care side of things, though I know from experience how much effort is put into that. I think funding and resourcing is probably, to be honest with you, one of the biggest things that could help schools deliver better in-house support. I think it's a massive conversation, though, isn't it? Mental health support for young people. There's a lot that's still needed, and I've desperately hope that we'll be able to get to that point at some point very soon. But yeah, in the meantime, I agree with you about in-house support in schools and colleges, but I'm also grateful that there is support outside of that for the students who can't access it from their school or college itself. Okie dokie. I think we'll leave it there, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around, and I hope some of those answers have been useful. If there's anything I've mentioned that you want to follow up with me, please do feel free to get in touch. Also, the rest of the team at TSI is obviously here to help with any further kind of research stuff that you might be interested in. And we'll send out a bit of a survey after the event to find out how you found this webinar. So I'd really, really love your feedback. Positive and constructive, I welcome all of it. So yeah, thank you so much for coming along. We'll send all the bits and pieces out to you after this. And genuinely, I really appreciate you spending an hour with me. So thank you very much, and go and enjoy the weather. Hopefully the sun is still shining. Thanks very much, everyone. See you later.